Hello, welcome to Lifespan Development. This is Mike Emmer, your adjunct instructor, and today we will cover Chapter 1, Basic Concepts and Methods. What we're going to cover today is the introduction to human development, key issues in the study of human development, and research methods and designs. There's a lot of learning objectives being covered as 2 pages of this, but we're going to look at development by early philosophers, lifespan perspective, major domains, how developmentalists view the 2 sides of the nature-nurture debate, what is continuity and discontinuity, and how do 3 kinds of age-related change differ, how does consideration of context, which change occurs, improve scientists' understanding of human development, what are the goals of scientists who study human development, what descriptive methods do developmental scientists use, what primary advantage of the experimental method, and what are the pros and cons of cross-sectional, longitudinal, and sequential research designs, and why is cross-cultural research important to study human development, and what are ethical standards that developmental researchers follow. So first of all, for the introduction, human development is a study of age-related behavior, changes in behavior, thinking, emotion, and personality. It's relatively a new discipline. It began early in the 19th century, along with the use of scientific method of observation. Before that, early philosophers base their ideas of development on spiritual authorities, philosophical orientations, and deductive logic. For instance, Augustine of Hippo said humans are born selfish and must seek spiritual rebirth. This is the Christian notion of the original sin that teaches that children are born with a selfish nature and they must basically be spiritually reborn so they're not selfish. The developmental outcomes of this is that individuals have a natural struggle to overcome immoral actions. Now, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, on the contrary, or to the opposite effect, also believed in the idea of interaction between internal and external forces, but he claimed that all human beings are naturally good, and they seek out experiences that help them to grow. For Rousseau, the goal of human development is to achieve one's inborn potential. Deprivation leads to frustration and anger. So basically, he emphasized the need for nurturance, that if a person is nurtured adequately, they will reach their fullest potential. The outcomes of this philosophy is that children's environment interferes or encourages one's potential. John Locke insisted that at birth the mind is a blank slate. In Latin that's called tabula rasa. He believed that all knowledge, he argued, is created by experience. And this outcome is really children are passive recipients of the environment, that it's basically all nurture. And individual differences are due to different experiences growing up. Charles Darwin was the first one who had an organized study of human development. And that was basically, it started with his teachings on evolution and study on evolution. He actually had he had 10 children. And he did what's called baby biographies, which he made detailed records of his own children's early years. And he tried to use the study to come up with information to validate evolution. He proposed studying children's development to better understand the evolution of the human species. Now, Stanley Hall conducted one of the first scientific studies of child development. He was a psychologist, 1891, from Clark University. He wrote the book Contents of Children's Minds on Entering School. And he really had an emphasis on creating norms or average ages at which developmental milestones occur. He was able to track development of individual children, which led to eventually to norm reference tests, which are developed later by Arnold Giselle. He coined the phrase storm and stress to refer to the adolescent stage. Arnold Giselle followed up with systematic description of children across domains, especially in their first 5 years of life. He came up with the term maturation, which occurs naturally as a result of genetically programmed sequence or pattern of change. He developed really the first normed reference tests today. If you think about the ACT, the SAT, or the ASVAB, this follows along the line of Arnold Giselle. He also was the first to use movie cameras and one-way mirrors to create a non-intrusive observation that does not affect the observations. We'll talk about that more later. Now, with the lifespan perspective, up until 40 years ago, the focus was really only on child development. The new perspective is the lifespan perspective. It's important to notice that there's important changes in every period of development. Baltes, Rees, and Lipset in 1980 basically coined the term lifespan perspective, that both children and adults experience major life passages, parenthood, retirement. Paul Baltes also underlined the capacity for positive change or plasticity, that positive aspects of advanced age and development. He says individuals of all ages have the capacity for positive change. You know the saying, you can't teach old dogs new tricks. Well, that doesn't apply to anymore, not even to my old dog. He also Paul Baltes talks about the multi-contextual nature of development, which includes family, neighborhood, and culture. And he talked about plasticity and adaptability at all ages. He emphasized what's called the positive aspects of advanced age. He gives an example of Arthur Rubinstein, who was a pianist who could outperform younger musicians even while he was in his 80s. He did that by choosing the right pieces and compensating with physical loss with more and more practice. Also, he underlined interdisciplinary perspective and research, which involves anthropology, economics, sociology, and psychology to truly understand lifespan development. And then with age comes a need for strategies used to maximize gains and compensate for losses, like what I mentioned before. There are 3 broad domain categories when you consider domains and periods of development. Physical domain is a change in size and shape and characteristics of the body. For example, changes in puberty. Cognitive domain could be changes in thinking, memory, and problem solving. For instance, how some memory functions may deteriorate with age. Social domain involves changes in variables associated with individuals' relationship to others. For instance, a child's social skill development would fit under social domain. These are the different periods of development. Prenatal is from conception to birth. Infancy is from birth to when a child starts using language to communicate. Early childhood is from when a child uses language until they begin formal school. Middle childhood is from the beginning of school, which ranges from culture to culture until the onset of puberty. Adolescence starts with the biological marker of the onset of puberty until what the state considers as adult. Middle adulthood usually starts with around 40 years of age, which is kind of arbitrary. Late adulthood is more like around 60 years of age, which also is an arbitrary marker. Different cultures really set different legal boundaries that marked entry into adulthood. For instance, in Nebraska, it's 19, but if you cross the river into Iowa, it's 18. Some people use driving as a marker for adulthood, because you could also be waived into adult court for, for criminal accountability. Age 18 for signing contracts, 21 for buying alcohol, 24 for really being seen as economically independent. And then the age to join military in other countries, it's 15 in Laos, 16 in England, 17 in Nicaragua, 19 in Algeria, 20 in South Korea, 21 in Brazil, 22 in Afghanistan. So try to think about what marks the end of each of these periods of development. For instance, prenatal was birth, infancy was using language to communicate, early childhood was entering formal school, middle childhood was marked with the onset of puberty, adolescence, the end was marked with turning of legal age, early adulthood ends with turning 40, middle adulthood turning 60 or retiring or menopause, and then late adulthood ends with death. Pretty morbid. Key issues in studying human development is the nature versus nurture debate, which is not necessarily a debate as much as we've really moved away from a debate of either or to really considering both. In nature, there's inborn propensities, biological influences, or inborn biases, or temperament or personality. Nurture has to do with environmental influences. Watson made a comment in 1930, give me a dozen healthy infants, well-formed, and my own specified world to bring them up in, and I'll guarantee to take anyone at random and train them to be a doctor, a lawyer, a merchant, a chief, regardless of their talents or their pensions, abilities, vocations, or race of ancestors, which really focus on the importance of nurturing for a person to reach their full potential. Continuity versus discontinuity. Continuity has to do with quantitative change or amount and degree. For instance, as a child grows and gets taller, that's continuity. Discontinuity is more of qualitative change, which is step-like change. For instance, this is where you need like stage theory to explain it. For instance, puberty is qualitative. So what the advantage is when the quantitative is clear and distinct and measurable. The disadvantage is it's limited to physical growth, where discontinuity advantages is it considers reorganization and wholly new strategies and qualities or skills. Not all development occurs in stages or is continuous in nature. Another way to look at it, if development consists only of additions, the concept of stages is not needed. That's continuity, measuring height, age, weight. If development involves reorganization or emergent strategies, quality or skills, then stages are useful. For instance, if I'm measuring identity development. 3 types of change, qualitative change. There's what's called normative age-graded universal changes. This is what's common to every member of a species. For instance, your social clock or age norms. It defines a sequence of normal life experiences. For instance, at what age you have your first date, marriage, childbirth, retirement. However, this can lead to what's called ageism, which is prejudice based on age, where there's expected behaviors for each age level. Normative history-graded changes. That's where your cohort or generational effects. This group of individuals born in the same range of years have a shared historical experience. And sometimes different cohorts may have quite a different life experiences based on their history. And then non-normative changes are unique unshared changes or individual differences. This could be genetic differences or things that happen in a critical period or a sensitive period, which I'll talk more about later, or atypical development. So example of a cohort effect is where children and adolescents were studied during the Great Depression. Children born in 1920 who were teens during the Depression, and those born in 1928, which were small children during the Depression, found out that the teens were forced into adulthood. However, they took on odd jobs for money. They felt needed by their family. Where those were young children during the Depression, their families suffered more. There was a lack of cohesion. As a result, the children were less hopeful and less confident compared to the teens, the cohort that was older. So taking a critical look, think about, has your cohort been affected by 9/11? Individuals who were born in 1985 were in high school during the terrorist attacks. Has their worldview changed as a result of that historical event? Compared to people who were born later, who it may not have a significant effect on them. Let's talk about vulnerability and resilience. This is kind of a pretty current trend in psychology, where the same environment can affect different children differently. The effect depends on the qualities a child brings to interactions. For instance, one child might have some vulnerable things happen. Let's say alcoholic parents, or maybe there's a death in the family, which would bring on trauma. These environments can cause different effects. Where resilient children, they have more of an optimal environment. Bowman in 2013 noted that resilience to childhood trauma depends on what's called protective factors. A child's intelligence, coordination, temperament. One caring adult can make a significant change in how they handle different situations. We'll talk more about that later. Gender can make a difference in the context when it comes to when you consider sexism or harassment. It also influences individual development and the interaction between characteristics and environmental influences, and is influenced by gender. These are some characteristics or factors in context of development that lead to delinquency. If you look at individual differences related to timing, the critical period, if you imagine ducklings, the following instinct. Within 15 hours of them being born, they need to follow something, otherwise they lose that following instinct, which is crucial for their survival. The sensitive period is like how an infant is treated, can affect how they bond to adults. On-time events would be like, and off-time events can affect timing. Atypical development is like abnormal development. The double whammy is like a vulnerable child. Let's say they have a parent who's struggling with alcoholism, mental illness, or experience abuse, emotional or physical, or some sort of childhood trauma like death, divorce of a parent, or a suicide of a family member. A child may or may not be able to adjust in a healthy way. The double whammy is if they have this vulnerable child plus a poor environment, where that adds to the stress. Having both leads to real poor outcomes on average for students. So the goals of developmental science, it's influenced by what's called the scientific method. It's to describe development, explain the development, predict developmental events, and have some influence on the developmental outcome. Eventually, they want to use findings to influence developmental outcomes. For instance, as memory declines, maybe the research findings can help design training programs to help recover memory to stroke victims. Now, theories set statements that propose general principles of development. Are they the same? No, theories are statements that propose general principles of development. They provide useful theories produce predictions or hypotheses that can be tested, and which is testable by data collection. So descriptive methods used in scientific method is one is defining variables, and then trying to come up with a relationship. A variable could be like years of age. One variable can relate to another variable. For instance, years of age and memory decline. Is there a relationship? It depends. Decide which two statements you agree with that would defend your position. In your book, they give an example where a parent whose child has been molested by a neighbor. Overwhelmingly, a majority of traumatized children have shown no long-term effects. However, some factors should be considered. How long did the abuse last? What age did it begin? What was the child's personality and how parents reacted? So whether a child will be able to bounce back from this, it depends. Now, relevant research findings should be the most important factor in the formation of social policies, or should research findings represent only one of several sources of information that ought to be considered in the formation of social policies? That's a question to consider. Should we consider other factors, or should the research findings dictate social policy? Now, there's several different ways to collect data using a scientific method. One is use what's called naturalistic observation. This is where you observe people in a normal environment, which may include schools or assisted living facilities or in their home. And the strength is you can see people in their natural environment. Weakness is there's what's called observer biases. We tend to see what we want to see. There's a limited generalizability. In other words, what you see in one situation might not apply to another. It's also time-consuming. Case studies is more of an in-depth examination of an individual. It's useful in making decisions about individuals on a case-by-case basis. Now, laboratory observation is more of a controlled setting for study. It's different from naturalistic observation in that you have some degree of control over your environment. Now, another example of collecting data is through surveys, interviews, and questionnaires. Questionnaires help us collect data from large populations. They're usually close-ended questions. We can apply the statistics to responses. Interviews are more one-on-one case studies, covers a smaller number of people, but however you can gain more detailed from the open-ended questions. Methods could vary by the type of questions asked or answers recorded, or the sample, which is representative of the population you're studying. Subjects sometimes are influenced by perceived social desirability of their answers. So there's sometimes the responses aren't always as truthful as we hope people to be. Now, what you want to do when you make your observations and collect your data is you'll try to find if there's a correlation. This describes the strength of the relationship between two variables. If it's a positive correlation, you have high scores on one variable. They usually accompany high scores on the other. For instance, better educated people generally have higher income. So the more education, the more income. A negative correlation scores on two variables that move in opposite directions. For instance, better educated people are less likely to smoke. So the more education, the lower the chance that they're smoking. Now these correlations range from a -1 to being a negative correlation to a +1 as a strong positive correlation. If it's a 0, then it means there's no correlation. Now keep in mind that correlation, it does not mean causality. There's a large correlation between two variables. It does not mean that one variable causes another. We have to consider what's called spurious relationships that could be considered. For instance, this is kind of a silly one, but there's a positive correlation of ice cream consumption with climate change. However, one does not necessarily cause the other. Let's look at experimental designs. Of course, you start out with a hypothesis, and you want to test it to see if one causes another. And you have what's called the experimental group, and then you have what's called the control group. The experimental group gets treatment the experimenter think will produce a particular effect. The control group gets no treatment or neutral treatment. It's important to be able to distinguish independent variable, or the cause, from the dependent variable, which is the effect. So independent variable, which is often used as X, causes Y, and the dependent variable depends on the cause. Quasi-experiments are where participants are not randomly assigned as experimental or control groups. Sometimes researchers compare members of naturally occurring groups by income, marital status, or religion. For instance, instead of breaking groups randomly into experimental or control groups, they might have children in daycare compared with children raised at home. Let's take a closer look at the three general categories, which is called cross-sectional, longitudinal, and sequential research. Cross-sectional groups of people of different ages are compared, where longitudinal people in a single group are studied at different times of their lives, and sequential combines cross-sectional and longitudinal. And we'll go more in detail. With a cross-sectional design, people from different groups are studied at the same point of time. They can indicate age differences by age. Age-related differences may be confused with cohort or generational effects. For instance, by studying cohort effects, you get a result from historical factors not related to age or development. Let me give an example here. Different generations have unique experiences, and those generational effects can become entangled. For instance, your generation grew up with computers, where 100 years ago people didn't have radio, or your great-grandparents may have lived through World War II or the Great Depression of the 1930s. When and where you were born could affect nutrition, sleeping arrangements, or your age at marriage. In cross-sectional studies or one-shots, cohort and aging effects may become entangled. So let's take a look at cohort patterns here. In this cross-sectional study, researchers compared the ability to recognize various kinds of facial expressions across young adult, middle age, and older groups. This study is called cross-sectional because it's measured the same variable at the same time in people of different ages. Now, longitudinal designs take a look at the same individuals studied several times over a period of time. For instance, the Berkeley-Oakland growth study continued for several decades. And what they do is they look at individual consistencies and inconsistencies and net change over time. let me talk about advantage. Some problems is there's a practice or testing effect from giving the same test over and over again. Some respondents might anticipate the answers from doing it over and over again. There's what's called study attrition. Some participants drop out, they die, or they move away. A lot of times better educated, healthier people often remain in the study. This can create biases in studying aging. Now the Berkeley study studied a group of participants born in 1928, showed a sharp rise in self-confidence. They shared personality changes were triggered by common experiences in the social clock. If you notice cohort-related, age-related differences due to grouping by age, these results are from the classic study in Berkeley and Oakland. Okay. They were tested frequently in childhood and adolescence as well as 3 times in adulthood. Here you can see the sharp rise in self-confidence that occurred for both women and men in the group in their 30s, which is a pattern that may reflect a shared personality change triggered by common experiences of the social clock. Now, sequential designs, they combine the groups from at least 2 cohorts followed in the longitudinal study. This design allows for comparison of cohorts while also incorporating some degree of individual differences. This avoids the shortcomings of using just one design. Age group comparisons provide the same kind of information that a cross-sectional study would, and the comparisons of the scores or behaviors of participants in each group to their own scores or behaviors at an earlier testing point provide longitudinal evidence at the same time. So sequential designs also allow for comparison of cohorts. This shows an example of a cross-sequential design. These findings illustrate the strengths of the design. They tested more than 700 women in 1983, 86, 93, and 2003. Among the 700 were women who were born during the baby boom, and some were born earlier. The panel shows that the tendency of women in both cohorts to describe themselves as feminine increased across all 4 testing points. But B shows that women's perception of conflict within their marriage remained stable for pre-boomers, but declined dramatically among baby boomers. So this shows definitely cohort differences. Another importance of ethnography, which is studying 2 or more cultures or subcultures, or even age or ethnic groups, can help us notice that the research applies universally, that we can identify universal changes and maybe produce findings that could be used to improve other people's lives. So cross-cultural studies hope that they can use to improve people's lives by encouraging more cooperation and learning from collectivist cultures. Finally, research ethics is very important. Universities have what's called institutional review boards to make sure that research is ethical. What's important is that we protect people from unnecessary pain and suffering. Special attention is paid especially to studies of children, pregnant women, and individuals with learning or other disabilities. Key things in research is, above all, do no harm. Participants need to learn the possible risks and benefits of studying, and that they have the ability to withdraw without retribution. Confidentiality, that the research data is kept confidential. Knowledge of results, participants are to be given information about results. If any deception is given, it should be explained to participants after data is collected. Well, this concludes Unit 1. Have a great week.